The year is 793 AD. On a quiet island off the coast of northern England, monks go about their daily prayers at Lindisfarne Monastery, just as they have for generations. The morning mist rolls in from the North Sea, and everything seems peaceful, ordinary, routine. Then the horizon erupts with dragon-headed ships. Warriors pour onto the beach like wolves unleashed from hell itself. They carry axes that sing through the air, swords that drink deeply of blood, and shields painted with symbols that would haunt Christian nightmares for centuries to come. In a single morning, these raiders don't just steal gold and silver. They steal something far more precious: the illusion that anywhere in Europe is truly safe. This is the moment that changes everything. The moment when the Viking Age explodes into history like lightning splitting an ancient oak. But here's what almost nobody understands about that legendary raid on Lindisfarne. It wasn't the beginning of the Viking story. It was the eruption of forces that had been building for generations in the frozen fjords and windswept islands of Scandinavia. The real story starts decades earlier, in places most people can't even pronounce, with changes so subtle that even the Vikings themselves didn't realize they were about to reshape the entire medieval world. See, everyone thinks they know the Vikings. Horned helmets, which they never actually wore. Mindless berserkers, which completely misses their genius for strategy. Savage barbarians, which ignores the fact that they created some of the most sophisticated trade networks, political systems, and artistic achievements in medieval history. The truth is so much more fascinating than the myths. Over the next hour, we're going to trace the complete arc of Viking civilization, from its mysterious origins in the mists of Scandinavia to its transformation into the medieval kingdoms that would dominate northern Europe. We'll see how a collection of tribal societies scattered across some of the harshest terrain on Earth evolved into explorers who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, traders who established routes from Greenland to Constantinople, and warriors whose descendants would sit on thrones from Dublin to Kiev. This isn't just the story of raids and battles, though we'll definitely cover those. This is the story of one of history's most remarkable transformations. How the Vikings evolved from tribal farmers scratching out a living in the far north into the architects of a medieval world system that connected 4 continents. And I've spent months researching primary sources, archaeological evidence, and the latest scholarship to bring you details that most documentaries completely miss. We're talking runic inscriptions that rewrite what we thought we knew about Viking society, recent archaeological discoveries that reveal the true sophistication of their technology, and DNA evidence that's forcing historians to completely reconsider who the Vikings actually were. But before we dive into dragon ships and legendary warriors, we need to understand something crucial. The Vikings didn't emerge from nowhere. They were the product of specific geographic, climatic, and cultural pressures that had been building in Scandinavia for centuries. The raid on Lindisfarne was just the moment when those pressures finally exploded outward into the wider world. So let's go back to the beginning. Not to 793, but to the centuries before, when the foundations of Viking civilization were being laid in a landscape that would forge some of the most formidable people in human history. Picture Scandinavia in the 6th and 7th centuries. This is a land of impossible contrasts. Summer days when the sun never sets, winter nights that stretch for months, fjords that cut like sword wounds through mountains older than complex life itself, forests so dense and dark that they spawned legends of gods and monsters that still echo in our culture today. The people living in this harsh paradise weren't yet called Vikings. That term wouldn't emerge for another 2 centuries. Instead, they were known by tribal names that have mostly vanished from history. The Geats of southern Sweden, the Sverre who would give Sweden its name, the Danes who were already beginning to dominate the southern regions, and dozens of smaller groups scattered across Norway's impossible coastline. But these weren't primitive peoples struggling for survival. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated societies with complex social hierarchies, advanced metalworking techniques, and artistic traditions that produced some of the most beautiful objects of the early medieval period. At Vendel in Sweden, excavations have uncovered warrior graves filled with weapons and armor so exquisite that they rival anything produced in the supposedly more civilized courts of Francia or Byzantium. The key to understanding early Scandinavian society lies in recognizing how geography shaped culture. In most of Europe, agriculture formed the foundation of civilization. Large, stable populations settled in fertile river valleys and built their societies around farming. But Scandinavia was different. The growing season was short, the soil often poor, and much of the best agricultural land was scattered across islands and coastal regions separated by mountains, forests, and most importantly, water. Water became the highway system of early Scandinavia. While other Europeans struggled to move goods and people overland through dense forests and across rivers, the Scandinavians developed boat-building technologies that turned every fjord, lake, and coastal inlet into a potential trade route. They didn't just adapt to their watery environment. They mastered it in ways that would eventually allow them to navigate from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. This maritime focus created a fundamentally different kind of society. Instead of the land-based feudalism that was emerging elsewhere in Europe, Scandinavian communities developed around what we might call naval aristocracies. The most prestigious members of society weren't just those who controlled the most land, but those who commanded the finest ships and could lead the most successful expeditions. The ship itself became the ultimate symbol of status and power. When a Scandinavian chieftain died, he might be buried in his vessel, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, and sometimes even sacrificed servants. These ship burials, found throughout Scandinavia, reveal a culture that saw the journey to the afterlife as literally a voyage across cosmic waters. But the most important aspect of early Scandinavian society was its fundamental mobility. Unlike their European neighbours, who were increasingly tied to specific plots of land, Scandinavian communities remained fluid, adaptable, and always ready to move. A family might farm in summer, raid in autumn, trade in winter, and explore in spring. This flexibility would prove crucial when climatic and political changes began pushing Scandinavian society toward its explosive expansion. The climate shift that helped trigger the Viking Age was subtle but profound. Around the 7th century, Northern Europe began experiencing what climatologists call the medieval warm period. Temperatures rose just enough to extend growing seasons, reduce sea ice, and make previously marginal lands more habitable. For most of Europe, this was simply a period of increased prosperity. For Scandinavia, it was revolutionary. Warmer temperatures meant that previously inaccessible sea routes opened up. Coastal areas that had been locked in ice for much of the year became navigable. Most importantly, the population began to grow rapidly as agricultural yields improved and infant mortality declined. By the 8th century, Scandinavia was experiencing something it had never dealt with before: overpopulation relative to available resources. This population pressure coincided with significant political developments that would prove equally important. Throughout the 7th and early 8th centuries, successful war leaders were beginning to consolidate power across larger territories. In Denmark, the Silding dynasty was establishing control over vast areas. In Sweden, the Yngling dynasty was expanding its influence. In Norway, dozens of petty kingdoms were beginning the long process of unification. These emerging kingdoms created both opportunities and problems. On one hand, they could organize larger military expeditions and more extensive trade networks. On the other hand, they reduced opportunities for ambitious young men to achieve status through traditional means. If your local king was now subordinate to a high king, and that high king controlled all the best agricultural land, where did that leave the younger sons of ambitious families? The answer was increasingly clear. Look beyond Scandinavia itself. But the Vikings didn't become Vikings overnight. The transformation from tribal raiders to the masters of medieval warfare was gradual, involving technological innovations, tactical developments, and cultural changes that unfolded over several generations. The most important innovation was in shipbuilding. The early Scandinavians had always been skilled boat builders, but around the 7th century they achieved a breakthrough that would change naval history forever. They perfected the clinker-built longship, a vessel that was simultaneously seaworthy enough for ocean voyages and shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers and land on beaches. These ships were marvels of engineering that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about working with wood, understanding water dynamics, and balancing the competing demands of speed, cargo capacity, and durability. A typical longship could carry 30 to 60 warriors, travel at speeds that wouldn't be matched by sailing vessels for centuries, and most importantly, appear suddenly wherever there was water deep enough to float it. The psychological impact of these ships cannot be overstated. Imagine being a medieval peasant working in fields near a river, secure in the knowledge that any serious military threat would have to approach overland, giving you plenty of warning. Then suddenly, without any advance notice, a dragon-headed ship appears around the river bend, disgorging armed warriors who proceed to pillage your village before disappearing back into the water system as quickly as they came. This tactical mobility was revolutionary. Previous military campaigns in medieval Europe were ponderous affairs involving months of preparation, slow-moving armies, and predictable routes of advance. The Vikings introduced something entirely new. The lightning raid, appearing from nowhere, striking hard and fast, and vanishing before any organized response could be mounted. But the longship was just one component of a broader military revolution. The Vikings also developed distinctive weapons, armor, and fighting techniques that reflected their unique strategic situation. The famous Viking sword was designed not just for individual combat, but for the specific demands of shipborne warfare. It had to be effective in cramped conditions, quick to deploy, and versatile enough to function both as a weapon and as a tool. More importantly, the Vikings perfected what we might call amphibious warfare centuries before the term was invented. They understood how to coordinate sea and land operations, how to use rivers as highways into the heart of enemy territory, and how to establish temporary bases that could support extended campaigns far from home. The cultural changes were equally significant. Scandinavian society began to glorify not just courage in battle, which had always been important, but specifically the kind of courage required for long-distance expeditions into unknown territories. The ideal warrior wasn't just someone who could fight well in defense of his home, but someone who could thrive in completely alien environments, adapt to unexpected challenges, and return home with tales of distant lands and exotic plunder. This cultural shift is reflected in the evolution of Scandinavian poetry and storytelling. The older heroic traditions had focused on defending one's homeland and dying gloriously in familiar surroundings. The new stories increasingly celebrated exploration, cunning, and the ability to survive and prosper in strange lands among foreign peoples. Religion played a crucial role in this transformation. The complex pantheon of Scandinavian deities provided multiple models for how to live a heroic life. Odin, the All-Father, was not just a war god, but a wanderer who travelled throughout the 9 worlds, seeking knowledge and wisdom. Thor protected the community, but also ventured into giant land to face monsters and challenges. Freya brought prosperity, but also represented the courage to sail into unknown waters. These religious traditions created a worldview that saw exploration and expansion not as abandonment of community responsibilities, but as the highest expression of heroic virtue. A young warrior who set sail for unknown lands wasn't deserting his people. He was following in the footsteps of the gods themselves. The combination of population pressure, technological innovation, political consolidation, and cultural transformation created what historians call the Viking explosion. But this explosion needed a catalyst, a specific event or opportunity that would channel all these building pressures into actual expansion. That catalyst came from an unexpected source: the political chaos that was consuming the rest of medieval Europe. By the late 8th century, the continent was fragmenting along multiple fault lines. The Carolingian Empire, despite its impressive territorial extent, was struggling to maintain effective control over its far-flung territories. The Islamic expansion had disrupted traditional Mediterranean trade routes. The Byzantine Empire was focused on conflicts in the east. Most importantly for the Vikings, the coastal regions of Western Europe were increasingly prosperous, but decreasingly well defended. The Christian monasteries that dotted the coasts of Britain and Ireland represented particularly tempting targets. They were wealthy, having accumulated centuries of donations from pious believers. They were poorly defended, as monks had no military training and relied on their sacred status for protection, and they were often located on islands or coastal promontories that were perfect for ship-based attacks. But the monasteries weren't just easy targets, they were symbolic ones. By attacking the most sacred sites of Christian civilization, the Vikings weren't just seeking plunder, they were making a statement about their own power and the weakness of their enemies' gods. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical destruction. Each successful raid demonstrated that the Christian God could not protect his most devoted servants, while the Viking gods clearly favored their warriors with victory after victory. This had profound effects on both Viking confidence and Christian morale throughout the early years of the Viking Age. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't just a military victory, it was a proof of concept that would reshape the strategic thinking of ambitious Scandinavians for generations. Word of the attack spread through the fjords and valleys of the north like wildfire. Here was evidence that the wealthy Christian lands to the south weren't just vulnerable, they were practically defenseless against the new style of warfare that Scandinavian innovation had made possible. But understanding why Lindisfarne became such a turning point requires us to examine what was happening inside Scandinavian society in the decades leading up to 793. The transformation wasn't just about better ships or sharper swords. It was about the emergence of a completely new social class, the professional adventurer warrior who would become the archetypal Viking. In traditional Scandinavian society, warfare had been largely defensive and seasonal. Farmers would take up arms to protect their communities during the summer months, then return to their fields and workshops. But the population pressures and political changes of the 8th century created something unprecedented. Groups of young men who had no access to productive land and no role in the increasingly centralized political structures that were emerging across the north. These displaced warriors faced a choice that would define the next 3 centuries of European history. They could accept reduced status in their home communities, competing for scraps of inheritance and minor positions in royal courts. Or they could seek their fortunes in the wider world, using their skills and the revolutionary new longship technology to carve out wealth and glory from foreign lands. The decision wasn't difficult. By the late 8th century, warrior bands were forming throughout Scandinavia with the explicit purpose of conducting overseas expeditions. These weren't desperate refugees or mindless raiders. They were highly organized military entrepreneurs who understood that the changing political landscape of Europe had created unprecedented opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The composition of these early Viking bands reveals the sophistication of their enterprise. Archaeological evidence from weapon hoards and grave goods shows that Viking expeditions included not just warriors, but craftsmen who could repair weapons and ships, traders who understood foreign markets and currencies, navigators who could find their way across open ocean, and even specialists in siege warfare who could reduce fortified positions. More importantly, these bands operated according to carefully developed codes of conduct that balanced individual ambition with collective success. The famous Viking institution of blood brotherhood wasn't just ceremonial bonding, It was a practical system for ensuring loyalty and cooperation among men who might be thousands of miles from any familiar authority structure. The early raids also reveal something crucial about Viking strategic thinking that contradicts the popular image of mindless berserkers. The targets weren't chosen randomly or out of religious hatred. They were selected according to sophisticated intelligence gathering that evaluated wealth, defenses, political situation, and escape routes. The Vikings were conducting what we would recognize today as detailed reconnaissance missions, often years in advance of actual attacks. Lindisfarne was chosen not because it was the holiest site in northern England, but because it offered the perfect combination of accessible wealth, minimal defences, and symbolic value. The monastery sat on an island that could only be reached on foot at low tide, making it seem secure to its inhabitants while actually creating the perfect trap for anyone caught there when Viking ships appeared on the horizon. The attack itself was executed with clinical precision. The raiders arrived at dawn, when the monks would be gathered for morning prayers and unable to scatter. They secured the island's only escape route, systematically looted the monastery's treasures, and were back at sea before any mainland response could be organized. The entire operation probably lasted less than 6 hours, but the psychological impact would last for centuries. Chronicles from across Christian Europe describe the terror that the Lindisfarne raid inspired, not just because of the violence, though that was certainly shocking, but because of what the attack represented: the emergence of a new kind of enemy that could appear anywhere, any time, without warning. The success at Lindisfarne triggered what can only be described as a gold rush mentality throughout Scandinavia. Young warriors who had heard tales of the easy plunder and swift victory began organizing their own expeditions. The technology and tactics that had made Lindisfarne possible were rapidly disseminated throughout the warrior communities of the north. Within a decade of the first raid, Viking attacks were being reported from Ireland to the Frankish coast. But these weren't random acts of violence. They were part of a systematic exploration of European weakness that would eventually evolve into permanent conquest and settlement. The Irish chronicles provide some of the most detailed accounts of these early raids, partly because Ireland's fragmented political situation made it an ideal testing ground for Viking tactics. The island was divided among dozens of small kingdoms that spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. The monasteries that dotted the Irish landscape were even wealthier than their English counterparts, having benefited from centuries of relative peace and religious devotion. The Vikings approached Ireland methodically, beginning with hit-and-run raids on coastal monasteries, then gradually pushing inland along the river systems. They quickly learned to exploit Irish political divisions, allying with some kingdoms against others, and eventually establishing permanent bases that would become the first true cities in Irish history. The establishment of long forts, fortified ship camps, marked a crucial evolution in Viking strategy. These weren't just temporary raiding bases, but permanent installations designed to support extended campaigns and protect accumulated plunder. The Long Fort at Dublin, established around 841, became the prototype for Viking urban development and the foundation of what would eventually become one of medieval Europe's most important trading centres. But the most significant development wasn't military or economic, it was cultural. The Vikings were learning to be more than raiders. They were becoming adaptable colonists who could integrate themselves into foreign societies while maintaining their own identity and independence. This adaptability would prove crucial as Viking expansion encountered increasingly sophisticated resistance. The easy victories of the early raids had been possible partly because European defenders were unprepared for the new style of warfare that longships made possible. But by the mid-9th century, that was beginning to change. The Frankish Empire, under Charlemagne and his successors, began implementing defensive measures specifically designed to counter Viking tactics. Coastal fortifications were strengthened, River mouths were blocked with chains and underwater obstacles, and mobile cavalry forces were organized to respond quickly to Viking landings. More importantly, European leaders began to understand that Viking raids weren't just military problems, but economic opportunities. Instead of simply trying to drive off Viking attacks, some rulers began negotiating with Viking leaders, offering tribute payments in exchange for peace, or even hiring Viking warriors as mercenaries in their own conflicts. This shift from pure raiding to a more complex relationship with European powers marked the beginning of the Viking Age proper. The raiders who had emerged from Scandinavia as simple predators were evolving into something far more sophisticated, a new factor in European politics that could no longer be ignored or simply repelled. The transformation is most clearly visible in the career of leaders like Ragnar Lodbrok, whose historical existence remains debated among scholars but whose legendary exploits capture the essence of this evolutionary moment. Whether or not Ragnar was a real person, the stories told about him reflect the emergence of Viking leaders who thought in terms of kingdoms rather than just raiding expeditions, who understood diplomacy as well as warfare, and who could envision permanent conquest rather than temporary plunder. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 represented the culmination of this evolution. This wasn't a raiding force, but a conquest army designed to seize and hold territory permanently. Led by figures who claimed descent from legendary heroes, equipped with siege engines, and supported by supply chains that stretched back to Scandinavia, the Great Army demonstrated that the Vikings had learned to wage war on a completely different scale. The invasion of England also revealed how Viking society itself was changing. The warriors who crossed the North Sea in 865 weren't just seeking portable wealth that could be carried back to Scandinavia. They were looking for land to settle, kingdoms to rule, and opportunities to establish permanent dynasties in foreign territories. This shift from raiding to conquest reflected deeper changes in Scandinavian society. The population pressures that had initially driven young warriors overseas were now being resolved not by temporary expeditions, but by permanent emigration. Entire families were beginning to follow the warrior bands, bringing with them the skills and traditions necessary to establish lasting settlements. The archaeological evidence from Viking settlements in England, Ireland, and the Scottish Islands reveals communities that were simultaneously Scandinavian and local, maintaining traditional crafts and customs while adapting to new environments and integrating with existing populations. These weren't military occupations, but genuine colonies that would eventually evolve into integral parts of medieval European civilization. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was its speed. In less than a century, the Vikings had evolved from tribal raiders into the founders of kingdoms that would shape European development for centuries to come. The same longships that had carried the first raiders to Lindisfarne were now transporting settlers to Iceland, traders to Constantinople, and explorers toward the edge of the known world. The success of Viking expansion created new pressures and opportunities that would drive the next phase of their remarkable story. As Scandinavian settlements spread across the North Atlantic and down the rivers of Eastern Europe, they encountered challenges that would test every aspect of their adaptability and force them to evolve yet again. The stage was set for the High Viking Age, when Scandinavian influence would reach its greatest extent, and the descendants of tribal farmers would find themselves ruling from Dublin to Kiev, from Iceland to the gates of Constantinople itself. The transformation from seasonal raiders to permanent conquerors created a problem that no Viking leader had anticipated. Success itself was becoming the enemy of further success. By the middle of the 9th century, the early raids that had seemed so revolutionary were starting to encounter diminishing returns. European defenders were learning to adapt. Monasteries were building stronger fortifications or moving their treasures inland. Coastal communities were establishing early warning systems. Most importantly, local rulers were beginning to organize coordinated responses that could turn Viking mobility from an advantage into a trap. But the Vikings possessed something that would prove even more valuable than their famous adaptability, an almost supernatural ability to recognize when old strategies were failing and completely reinvent themselves before anyone else realized the game had changed. The shift began in the rivers, began in the Yi. While most accounts of Viking expansion focus on dramatic sea battles and coastal raids, the real revolution was happening in places like the Seine, the Thames, and the countless waterways that cut through the heart of medieval Europe, like arteries carrying Viking influence into regions that had never seen a longship. River warfare required completely different skills than coastal raiding. You couldn't rely on surprise and quick escape when you were hundreds of miles inland, surrounded by potentially hostile territory. Instead, you needed to understand local politics, establish supply lines, and most crucially, learn when to fight and when to negotiate. The Vikings who pushed up the French rivers in the 840s and 850s weren't just looking for monasteries to plunder. They were conducting what amounted to military reconnaissance of the entire Carolingian Empire, testing its defenses, mapping its weaknesses, and identifying opportunities for something far more ambitious than simple raiding. What they discovered changed everything. The empire that had once seemed so formidable under Charlemagne was fracturing along political fault lines that created opportunities no Viking strategist could have imagined. Sons were fighting fathers for control of territories. Nobles were switching sides based on short-term advantages. Most importantly, everyone seemed willing to hire Viking warriors as mercenaries in their petty conflicts. This mercenary phase of Viking expansion is often overlooked in popular accounts, but it was absolutely crucial to everything that followed. When Frankish nobles hired Viking bands to fight their enemies, they weren't just gaining temporary military assistance. They were providing their hired warriors with detailed intelligence about European military capabilities, political weaknesses, and most importantly, the locations of wealth that had previously been beyond Viking reach. The Vikings learned that European warfare was fundamentally different from their own traditions. Where Scandinavian conflicts were typically resolved through single battles or personal combat, European campaigns could drag on for months or even years. Where Viking success depended on mobility and surprise, European victory often came through patient siege warfare and careful logistics. But most importantly, they learned that European politics was based on personal relationships and oath-making in ways that created both vulnerabilities and opportunities. A European lord's power depended on the loyalty of subordinates who could be bribed, threatened, or simply convinced that their interests lay elsewhere. This knowledge transformed Viking strategy in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until the Great Heathen Army landed in England in 865. That invasion force represented the culmination of decades of intelligence gathering, alliance building, and strategic preparation that had been conducted under the guise of simple raiding and mercenary service. The army itself was unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Contemporary chronicles describe a force that included not just warriors, but siege engineers, cavalry specialists, and most importantly, political advisors who understood the complex web of relationships that held English kingdoms together. The leaders of this army, figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Uber, weren't just successful raiders who had decided to try their hand at conquest. They were strategic thinkers who had studied European weaknesses for years and designed their campaign to exploit specific vulnerabilities in English political organization. Their first target wasn't chosen for its wealth or symbolic value, but for its strategic position. York, the ancient Roman city that controlled access to northern England, represented the key to unraveling the entire English defensive system. By seizing York and establishing it as their primary base, the Vikings gained control of the river networks that connected northern England to the sea, effectively cutting off English kingdoms from each other and from potential continental allies. But the most brilliant aspect of the Viking conquest strategy was psychological rather than military. Instead of simply trying to defeat English armies in battle, they systematically undermined the ideological foundations that held English society together. Medieval kingdoms weren't just political entities. They were religious communities bound together by shared faith and common allegiance to Christian rulers who claimed divine sanction for their authority. The Vikings understood that destroying this ideological unity was more effective than winning any number of battlefield victories. The execution of King Edmund of East Anglia in 869 wasn't just the elimination of a political rival, it was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of the powerlessness of Christian faith against Viking steel. According to later accounts, Edmund was killed in a manner that deliberately mocked Christian martyrdom traditions, sending a message to every English noble and peasant that their God could not protect even the most pious rulers. This psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. As news of Edmund's death spread throughout England, local resistance began to collapse not through military defeat, but through the simple recognition that the old certainties no longer applied. If God would not protect a king who died for his faith, what hope did ordinary people have? The Vikings reinforced this message by systematically targeting the religious institutions that formed the backbone of English cultural identity. But unlike their earlier raids, which had focused on portable wealth, these attacks were designed to destroy the institutional memory that held communities together. When Vikings burned a monastery, they weren't just stealing its treasures, they were eliminating the schools that trained local administrators, the libraries that preserved legal traditions, and the scriptoriums that maintained the written records that legitimized property ownership and political authority. The result was a cascading collapse of institutional authority that went far beyond anything that simple military conquest could have achieved. Local nobles found themselves ruling communities that could no longer remember why they owed allegiance to anyone. Peasants discovered that the documents proving their rights to their land had gone up in smoke, along with the monasteries that had preserved them. Into this vacuum stepped Viking leaders, who offered something that traditional English authority could no longer provide: effective protection in exchange for loyalty. The Vikings weren't just conquerors. They were presenting themselves as alternative sources of legitimate authority for communities that had been abandoned by their traditional rulers. This approach proved so successful that within a decade of the Great Army's arrival, large portions of England were being governed according to what became known as the Danelaw, legal and administrative systems that blended Scandinavian traditions with local customs in ways that proved remarkably durable. The establishment of the Danelaw represented something unprecedented in European history: the creation of hybrid political systems that were simultaneously foreign and familiar, revolutionary and traditional. Viking jarls ruled English territories using legal codes that incorporated both Scandinavian concepts of personal honor and English traditions of community responsibility. More importantly, these hybrid systems proved more effective at maintaining order and prosperity than the purely English alternatives they replaced. Archaeological evidence from Danelaw territories shows increased trade, improved agricultural techniques, and urban development that surpassed anything seen in purely English regions during the same period. The success of the Danelaw had profound implications that extended far beyond England itself. Viking leaders throughout Scandinavia began to recognize that permanent conquest and settlement could be more profitable than traditional raiding, while European rulers started to understand that Viking expansion represented not just military threat, but political opportunity. The result was a fundamental shift in the nature of Viking activity throughout the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Where earlier generations had focused on hit-and-run raids designed to accumulate portable wealth, their successors increasingly pursued territorial conquest, aimed at establishing permanent domains that could be passed down to their children. This evolution from raiders to rulers created new challenges that tested every aspect of Viking adaptability. Governing settled populations required different skills than leading warrior bands. Maintaining political legitimacy demanded understanding of local customs and traditions. Most importantly, successful rule meant balancing the expectations of Scandinavian followers with the needs of indigenous subjects. The solutions Viking leaders developed to these challenges would reshape medieval Europe in ways that extended far beyond the territories they directly controlled. Their innovations in urban planning, legal systems, and administrative organization provided models that would be copied and adapted throughout the continent. But perhaps the most significant impact was cultural. The Viking settlements that spread across northern and western Europe created zones of cultural exchange where Scandinavian, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Frankish traditions blended to produce entirely new forms of art, literature, and social organization. The famous Lewis chessmen, carved in the 12th century, but reflecting artistic traditions that developed during the height of Viking settlement, exemplify this cultural synthesis. The pieces combine Scandinavian craftsmanship with European artistic motifs and gaming traditions that had been adapted from Islamic sources, creating objects that could only have emerged from the cosmopolitan world that Viking expansion had created. This cultural creativity extended to every aspect of life in Viking settlements. Archaeological excavations at York, Dublin, and other Viking cities reveal communities where traditional Scandinavian crafts were being adapted to local materials and markets, where foreign merchants were integrating into Viking trading networks, and where new forms of artistic expression were emerging from the collision of different cultural traditions. The urban centres that developed in Viking territories weren't just larger versions of traditional Scandinavian settlements. They were something entirely new, multicultural commercial hubs that connected previously isolated regions into integrated economic networks spanning continents. Dublin, established as a Viking long fort in 841, had evolved by the early 10th century into one of Europe's most important slave markets, a centre for amber and fur trading that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, and a manufacturing hub where craftsmen produced goods for markets from Iceland to Constantinople. The transformation of Dublin from a seasonal raiding base to a permanent commercial centre illustrates the broader evolution of Viking society during this crucial period. The warriors who had originally established the Long Fort were gradually being replaced by merchants, craftsmen, and administrators, whose success depended on maintaining peaceful relationships with both local populations and distant trading partners. This shift from military to commercial priorities required fundamental changes in Viking social organization and cultural values. The warrior ethos that had driven the initial expansion had to be balanced against the practical requirements of urban governance and long-distance trade. The result was the emergence of a new type of Viking leader, the merchant prince who combined traditional martial skills with sophisticated understanding of international commerce and diplomacy. Figures like Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin and Eric Bloodaxe of York represented this evolution, ruling territories that functioned as simultaneously as military strongholds and commercial empires. But the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was its speed and scope. Within a single generation, Viking communities had evolved from seasonal raiding bases into permanent settlements that were reshaping the economic and political landscape of medieval Europe. The success of these settlements created a feedback loop that accelerated Viking expansion even further. As news of profitable conquests and successful colonies spread back to Scandinavia, more warriors and settlers were attracted to overseas opportunities, while the wealth flowing back from established settlements funded ever more ambitious expeditions. By the end of the 9th century, Viking influence extended from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the rivers of Russia. But this expansion was creating new pressures and opportunities that would drive the next phase of their remarkable story into territories that would test every aspect of their legendary adaptability. The stage was set for the most ambitious phase of Viking expansion, the movement into the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, and the establishment of trade routes that would connect Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, creating commercial networks that spanned 3 continents, and forever changed the medieval global economy. The rivers of Eastern Europe carved pathways into a world that would challenge everything the Vikings thought they knew about conquest, trade, and survival itself. While their Western kinsmen were establishing kingdoms in England and Ireland, other Viking adventurers were pushing east through waterways that led not to familiar Christian monasteries, but to the edges of civilizations so alien and sophisticated that they made European courts seem primitive by comparison. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Dvina, these weren't just rivers, they were highways into a commercial universe that connected the fur-rich forests of the north to the silk markets of Constantinople and the silver mines of the Islamic world. But navigating these routes required more than longships and battle axes. It demanded diplomatic skills, commercial acumen, and cultural adaptability that would transform Swedish merchants into the founders of the Russian state. The story begins with Swedish traders who called themselves the Russ, a name that would eventually be applied to the vast territories they came to dominate. Unlike their Danish and Norwegian cousins who focused on Western expansion, these Eastern Vikings understood that the greatest opportunities lay not in raiding Christian settlements, but in establishing themselves as middlemen in trade networks that already existed between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. But the rivers of Eastern Europe presented challenges that no amount of Scandinavian shipbuilding expertise could solve. The Dnieper alone contained 7 major rapids that required ships to be dragged overland for miles at a time. The Volga led through territories controlled by nomadic peoples whose military traditions made Viking warriors look like amateurs. Most daunting of all, successful river trading required maintaining peaceful relationships with dozens of different peoples, each with their own languages, customs, and political systems. The solution the Rus developed was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of trying to conquer these river routes through force, they would control them through a combination of military intimidation and commercial partnership that transformed them from raiders into merchant princes. The process began with the establishment of fortified trading posts at strategic points along the major river systems. These weren't temporary camps like the Western long forts, but permanent settlements designed to support year-round commercial operations. Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk. These cities became the nodes of a trading network that would eventually span from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. But the most brilliant aspect of the Rus strategy was their approach to local populations. Instead of simply displacing existing communities, they integrated themselves into local political structures as military elites who could provide protection in exchange for tribute and trading privileges. The Slavic tribes that controlled much of the river territory found themselves with Scandinavian overlords who were more interested in maintaining profitable trade routes than in imposing foreign customs. This integration wasn't always peaceful. The Russian Primary Chronicle, compiled centuries later but based on earlier sources, describes numerous conflicts between Rus warbands and local populations. But these conflicts typically ended not with the complete subjugation of one side or the other, but with negotiated agreements that established the Vikings as ruling elites within existing social structures. The result was something unprecedented in Viking expansion: the creation of genuinely multi-ethnic states, where Scandinavian military leadership, combined with Slavic agricultural expertise and nomadic trading connections, to produce political entities that were more sophisticated and durable than anything the Vikings had established elsewhere. The transformation of Kiev under Rus rule illustrates this process perfectly. What had begun as a modest Slavic settlement became, under Viking leadership, one of medieval Europe's largest and most cosmopolitan cities. Contemporary accounts describe a commercial hub where merchants from Scandinavia traded alongside Byzantine Greeks, Islamic Arabs, and nomadic Khazars, creating a cultural melting pot that produced innovations in everything from military technology to religious practice. But the real key to Rus' success was their mastery of what we might call violence economics. The calculated use of military force to establish and maintain commercial relationships, rather than simply to acquire immediate plunder. A Rus trading expedition was simultaneously a merchant caravan and a military force capable of fighting its way through hostile territory if negotiations failed. This approach proved devastatingly effective when applied to the Byzantine Empire. The famous attack on Constantinople in 860, led by the Rus leaders Askold and Dir, wasn't primarily a raid designed to capture treasure. It was a demonstration of military capability designed to force the Byzantines to negotiate favorable trading terms. The psychological impact of Viking longships appearing in the Bosphorus, the first foreign fleet to threaten Constantinople in centuries, convinced Byzantine Emperor Michael III that it was cheaper to buy off these northern barbarians than to fight them. The resulting treaty established the Rus as privileged trading partners, with access to Byzantine markets that had been closed to most foreign merchants. More importantly, the treaty gave Rus merchants access to the vast commercial networks that connected Byzantium to the Islamic world, opening up trading opportunities that would make the Eastern Vikings far wealthier than their Western kinsmen who were still focused on raiding and territorial conquest. The Islamic connection proved particularly profitable. The Islamic world's insatiable demand for northern furs, amber, and slaves created a commercial pipeline that brought Middle Eastern silver flowing north through the Russian river systems in quantities that dwarfed anything available through Western European trade. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian hoards reveals the extent of this Eastern commerce. Swedish museum collections contain literally thousands of Islamic silver coins dating from the 9th and 10th centuries, many of them found in remote locations that could only have been reached through the Russian river routes. These coins represent just a fraction of the total silver flow that was buried and never recovered. The actual volume of trade was probably 10 times larger. But the Eastern trade routes demanded more than just commercial skills. They required understanding of Islamic law, Byzantine diplomacy, and the complex tribal politics of the steppes. The Rus, who succeeded in this environment, had to become cultural chameleons, adapting their behavior and appearance to meet the expectations of radically different societies. Contemporary Islamic accounts describe Rus merchants who had learned to speak Arabic, dress in local fashions, and conduct business according to Islamic commercial practices. Byzantine sources mention Rus diplomats who understood court protocol and could negotiate complex treaties in Greek. Most remarkably, some Rus leaders seem to have converted to Christianity or Islam when it served their commercial interests, while maintaining their traditional beliefs in private. This cultural flexibility was crucial because the Eastern routes weren't just trading networks. They were corridors of cultural exchange that exposed the Vikings to ideas and technologies that would transform Scandinavian society. The Rus, who returned home, brought with them not just silver and silk, but new concepts of urban planning, administrative organization, and political legitimacy that would influence the development of medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. The impact is most clearly visible in the evolution of Scandinavian royal ideology. The petty kings who had ruled tribal territories through personal charisma and military success began adopting the trappings of Byzantine and Islamic sovereignty. Elaborate court ceremonies, written legal codes, and administrative bureaucracies that could govern large territories without requiring the constant personal presence of the ruler. More importantly, the Eastern Vikings learned to think in terms of territorial states rather than personal followings. The Rus principalities that emerged in the 10th century weren't just larger versions of traditional Scandinavian chieftaincies. They were fundamentally different political entities, based on control of territory and trade routes, rather than personal loyalty relationships. This evolution is personified in the career of Vladimir I of Kiev, who ruled from 980 to 1015 and transformed the Rus state from a loose confederation of trading posts into a centralized monarchy that rivaled the Byzantine Empire in territorial extent and administrative sophistication. Vladimir's conversion to Christianity in 988 wasn't just a personal religious decision. It was a calculated political move designed to integrate his realm into the broader Christian commonwealth that dominated medieval Europe. But Vladimir's Christianity was distinctively Eastern in character, oriented toward Constantinople rather than Rome, and incorporating elements of traditional Slavic religiosity that would eventually evolve into the distinctive Orthodox culture of medieval Russia. This religious synthesis reflected the broader cultural fusion that characterized the Rus state, where Scandinavian political traditions combined with Slavic social customs and Byzantine administrative practices to create something entirely new. The success of the Rus experiment had profound implications for Viking expansion throughout Eastern Europe. Other Scandinavian groups began establishing their own river-based principalities, creating a network of Viking-ruled states that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. These Eastern Vikings developed their own distinctive culture that maintained connections to Scandinavia while adapting to local conditions in ways that their Western cousins had never achieved. The archaeological evidence from these Eastern settlements reveals communities that were simultaneously Scandinavian and Slavic, maintaining traditional crafts and burial customs, while adopting local agricultural techniques and architectural styles. The famous Gnezdovo cemetery near Smolensk contains graves that include both Viking weapons and Slavic pottery, Byzantine coins, and Scandinavian jewelry, creating a material culture that reflects the complex ethnic mixing that characterized the Rus territories. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Eastern expansion was economic. The silver that flowed north through the Russian rivers funded the continued expansion of Viking activity throughout Europe, providing the economic foundation for the great campaigns of the 10th and 11th centuries. The wealth accumulated through Eastern trade allowed Viking leaders to maintain larger military forces, build more ships, and support more ambitious expeditions than would have been possible through Western raiding alone. This economic foundation also enabled the Vikings to weather the increasing resistance they encountered in Western Europe, as their targets learned to defend themselves more effectively. When English kings began building fortified towns and organizing professional armies specifically designed to counter Viking tactics, the Eastern Vikings could continue their expansion because they had access to alternative sources of wealth and power. The Eastern expansion also provided a crucial demographic outlet that helped prevent the internal conflicts that might otherwise have developed as Scandinavian populations continued to grow. Young warriors who might have competed for limited opportunities at home could instead seek their fortunes in the vast territories opening up along the Russian rivers. This demographic pressure valve was particularly important because it allowed Scandinavian society to maintain its traditional warrior culture while avoiding the internal violence that had characterized earlier periods of population pressure. Instead of fighting each other for scarce resources, ambitious young Vikings could channel their energies into overseas expansion that benefited their home communities as well as themselves. The result was a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement in Scandinavia itself. The silver flowing back from the east funded monumental building projects, sophisticated artistic production, and the development of urban centers that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. The great trading towns of Birka, Hedeby, and Kaupang became cosmopolitan centers where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods and ideas. But the most important consequence of the Eastern expansion was strategic. By establishing control over the river routes that connected northern and southern Europe, the Vikings had positioned themselves at the center of medieval trade networks in ways that gave them influence far beyond their actual military capabilities. Any ruler who wanted to access the wealth of the north, furs, amber, iron, and timber, had to deal with Viking merchants and their political protectors. This economic leverage translated into political influence that extended far beyond the territories the Vikings directly controlled. Byzantine emperors hired Viking mercenaries for their most important military campaigns. Islamic rulers competed for Viking trading partnerships. Western European kings negotiated marriage alliances with Viking dynasties not just to end conflicts, but to gain access to the commercial networks that Viking expansion had created. The transformation was complete. In less than 2 centuries, the Vikings had evolved from tribal raiders into the architects of a medieval world system that connected 4 continents and created the first truly global economy in human history. But this success was creating new pressures and opportunities that would drive the final phase of Viking expansion into territories that would test every aspect of their legendary adaptability. The stage was set for the most audacious chapter of the Viking story, the westward expansion across the North Atlantic that would carry Scandinavian explorers to the edges of the known world and establish settlements in lands that wouldn't be reached by other Europeans for another 500 years. While the Eastern Vikings were building their river empires and transforming the commerce of 3 continents, their Western cousins were preparing to attempt something that would have seemed impossible to any rational observer, crossing the North Atlantic in open boats to reach lands that existed only in the fevered imagination of poets and storytellers. The westward expansion began not with grand strategic vision, but with the simple pressure of success itself. By the late 9th century, the most accessible territories in Britain and Ireland had been conquered, settled, or fortified to the point where they no longer offered easy opportunities for ambitious young Vikings. The river routes of Francia were increasingly well defended, and the Mediterranean expeditions that had once seemed so promising were encountering resistance from Islamic fleets that could match Viking seamanship with superior numbers. But the Atlantic Ocean stretched westward into mystery, and Viking culture had always celebrated the explorer who sailed beyond the horizon. The same restless energy that had driven the first raiders to Lindisfarne now pushed a new generation of adventurers toward waters that no European had ever crossed. The key to understanding this westward movement lies in recognizing how Viking society had evolved by the late 9th century. The tribal farmers who had launched the first raids had been replaced by a sophisticated maritime culture that saw the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway to opportunity. 3 generations of oceanic warfare had produced navigators who could find their way across hundreds of miles of open water using nothing but the stars, the flight patterns of seabirds, and an almost supernatural understanding of wind and current. More importantly, the social pressures that had originally driven Viking expansion were intensifying rather than diminishing. The successful raiders and conquerors of the early period had established themselves as local aristocracies in their adopted territories, but their sons faced the same problem that had motivated their grandfathers. Too many ambitious young men competing for too few opportunities. The difference was that this new generation possessed resources and capabilities that their ancestors could never have imagined. The wealth flowing back from Eastern trade routes, the technological innovations developed through centuries of shipbuilding experimentation, and most crucially, the accumulated knowledge of oceanic navigation that had been refined through generations of Atlantic warfare. The discovery of Iceland around 860 wasn't the result of a planned expedition, but rather the inevitable consequence of Viking maritime activity in the northern seas. Norwegian Vikings fleeing political consolidation under Harold Fairhair, Irish-based Vikings seeking new raiding opportunities, and merchants following seasonal trading routes, all converged on this previously unknown island that offered something unprecedented: empty land suitable for settlement. The initial reports must have seemed too good to be true. Here was an island larger than Ireland, with grasslands suitable for livestock, rivers teeming with fish, and most importantly, no indigenous population to resist Viking settlement. The volcanic landscape might seem forbidding to modern eyes, but to Vikings accustomed to the harsh environments of northern Scandinavia, Iceland represented paradise. Unlimited land for anyone bold enough to claim it. The settlement of Iceland unfolded with remarkable speed and organization. Within 60 years of the first discoveries, virtually every habitable valley had been claimed by Viking colonists who brought with them not just their families and livestock, but the entire cultural and legal framework of Scandinavian society. The famous Landnámabók, compiled centuries later, but based on careful oral traditions, records the names and origins of over 430 original settlers, revealing the scope and systematic nature of this colonization. But Iceland wasn't just another Viking colony. It became something unique in medieval Europe, a society deliberately designed according to principles that had been developing throughout the Viking expansion, but had never been fully implemented in territories where Vikings had to accommodate existing populations and political structures. The Icelandic Commonwealth that emerged in the 10th century represented the ultimate expression of Viking political innovation. Instead of kings or jarls ruling through personal authority, Iceland was governed by the Althing, an annual assembly where free farmers gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and coordinate collective action. This wasn't primitive democracy, but sophisticated republican government that balanced individual freedom with community responsibility in ways that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The legal system that developed in Iceland was equally revolutionary. Instead of royal justice imposed from above, disputes were resolved through complex systems of compensation and arbitration that treated violence as a problem to be solved, rather than a crime to be punished. The famous Icelandic sagas, composed generations later but reflecting this legal culture, reveal a society that celebrated individual honor while maintaining sophisticated mechanisms for preventing feuds from destroying community stability. More importantly, Iceland became a laboratory for cultural innovation that would influence all of Scandinavian civilization. Freed from the constraints of accommodating foreign populations or adapting to existing political structures, Icelandic settlers could develop distinctively Viking approaches to everything from architecture to poetry, from agriculture to religious practice. The result was a cultural flowering that produced some of the greatest achievements of medieval European civilization. The anonymous poets who composed the Eddic poems created a systematic mythology that preserved ancient Scandinavian beliefs while transforming them into sophisticated literary art. The saga writers who emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries developed narrative techniques that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in Europe until the Renaissance. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Icelandic society was its relationship to exploration and expansion. Unlike other medieval communities that focused on defending fixed territories, Iceland maintained the Viking tradition of seeing the ocean as a pathway to opportunity. Icelandic farmers who had established successful homesteads continued to launch expeditions westward, driven by the same combination of curiosity, ambition, and demographic pressure that had motivated their ancestors. This westward momentum led inevitably to the discovery of Greenland around 980 by Eric the Red, whose career exemplifies the complex motivations that drove Viking expansion during this period. Eric wasn't a landless younger son seeking his fortune, but an established Icelandic chieftain who had been outlawed for committing murders in local feuds. His expedition to Greenland was simultaneously exile and opportunity, punishment and potential redemption. The name Eric chose for his discovery reveals the sophisticated psychological understanding that characterized Viking expansion strategies. Greenland was partly accurate. The coastal regions where Vikings could establish settlements did have grasslands suitable for livestock, but it was also calculated marketing designed to attract settlers to what was obviously a more challenging environment than Iceland. The Greenland colonies that Eric established around 985 represented the furthest extension of European civilization until the age of Columbus. These weren't temporary outposts, but permanent settlements complete with churches, farms, and the full apparatus of medieval society, transplanted to an environment that tested every aspect of Viking adaptability. The archaeological evidence from these Greenland settlements reveals communities that maintained Scandinavian cultural identity while adapting to environmental challenges that would have defeated less flexible societies. The colonists learned to hunt seals and whales using techniques borrowed from indigenous populations, developed new architectural styles, suited to extreme cold, and created economic systems based on trading walrus ivory and polar bear pelts to European markets. But the most remarkable aspect of the Greenland expansion was its role as a launching point for even more audacious exploration. The same demographic and cultural pressures that had driven Vikings from Norway to Iceland to Greenland continued operating, pushing the most adventurous colonists to investigate rumours of land even further west. The voyages of Leif Erikson around 1000 AD represented the culmination of 5 centuries of Viking maritime development. The ships that carried him across the Labrador Sea to the coast of North America were the product of generations of technological refinement. The navigation techniques that guided him through uncharted waters had been developed through centuries of oceanic exploration. Most importantly, the cultural confidence that made such a voyage conceivable had been built through successful adaptation to increasingly challenging environments. The Viking arrival in North America, Vinland as they called it, marked the achievement of something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a continuous chain of settlements stretching from Scandinavia to the New World, connected by sea routes that Viking navigators could traverse with remarkable reliability. But the North American expeditions also revealed the limits of Viking expansion capabilities. Unlike their previous discoveries, Vinland wasn't empty land waiting for European settlement. It was inhabited by indigenous peoples who possessed their own sophisticated technologies and weren't intimidated by Viking military advantages that had proven so effective against European opponents. The encounters between Vikings and Native Americans, recorded in the Vinland sagas and partially confirmed by archaeological evidence at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland, marked the first sustained contact between European and American civilizations. These interactions were complex, involving trade, conflict, and cultural exchange that challenged both sides' assumptions about the nature of human society. The indigenous peoples the Vikings encountered weren't the primitive savages that European prejudice would later imagine, but sophisticated societies with their own military traditions, trading networks, and territorial claims. The skirmishes that developed between Viking expeditions and Native American communities weren't simple raids that Vikings could win through superior weapons and tactics, but complex conflicts that required diplomatic skills and cultural understanding that the Vikings hadn't needed to develop in their European expansion. More fundamentally, the North American environment presented challenges that even Viking adaptability couldn't fully overcome. The distances involved in maintaining supply lines between Greenland and Vinland stretched Viking logistical capabilities to their breaking point. The relatively small population of the Greenland colonies couldn't provide enough settlers to establish permanent communities in the face of indigenous resistance. Most crucially, the economic incentives that had driven previous Viking expansion simply didn't exist in North America. The wealth that had made Eastern expansion profitable, Islamic silver, Byzantine silk, European tribute, had no equivalent in Vinland. The furs and timber that North America could provide were readily available in Scandinavia itself. Without the economic foundation that had sustained previous Viking colonies, the North American settlements couldn't attract the continuous flow of settlers and supplies necessary for permanent establishment. The gradual abandonment of the Vinland colonies around 1020 marked not failure, but the recognition of practical limitations that even Viking determination couldn't overcome. The same rational calculation that had made Viking expansion so successful elsewhere now counseled withdrawal from territories that couldn't be profitably maintained. But the westward expansion had achieved something that would prove more important than any individual colony. It had demonstrated the extraordinary capabilities that Viking maritime culture had developed over 2 centuries of oceanic exploration. The techniques and knowledge that carried Vikings to North America would continue to influence northern European seafaring for centuries, providing the foundation for later expeditions that would eventually establish permanent European presence in the New World. More immediately, the Western expansion had profound effects on Viking society itself. The The successful settlement of Iceland and Greenland created new centres of Scandinavian culture that would preserve traditional values and practices even as the homeland underwent the political consolidation that was transforming tribal societies into medieval kingdoms. These Atlantic colonies also provided crucial economic and strategic resources that enhanced Scandinavian power in European affairs. Icelandic literary culture produced the historical and mythological works that preserved Viking identity across centuries of political change. Greenlandic hunters provided luxury goods: walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, narwhal tusks that were prized in European courts and gave Scandinavian rulers access to diplomatic and commercial opportunities that would otherwise have been unavailable. Most importantly, the westward expansion demonstrated that Viking culture possessed an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and innovation. The same people who had begun as tribal farmers in the fjords of Norway had successfully established thriving communities in environments ranging from the steppes of Russia to the ice fields of Greenland, from the trading cities of Ireland to the river systems of Eastern Europe. This adaptability would prove crucial as Viking expansion encountered the increasing resistance that marked the beginning of the end of the Viking Age proper. By the early 11th century, the easy targets had been eliminated, the profitable trade routes had been secured, and the available lands had been settled. The very success of Viking expansion had created a new strategic environment where traditional Viking advantages were increasingly neutralized by opponents who had learned to adapt their own tactics and technologies. The stage was set for the final transformation of Viking society. The evolution from expansionist warrior culture to the medieval kingdoms that would dominate Northern Europe for centuries to come. But this transformation would require abandoning many of the characteristics that had made Viking expansion possible, creating tensions and conflicts that would define the last century of the Viking Age. The great age of exploration and conquest was drawing to a close, but its consequences would reshape the medieval world in ways that extended far beyond the territories that Viking ships had reached. The networks of trade and communication that Viking expansion had created would survive the political changes that ended the Viking Age, providing the infrastructure for the commercial and cultural developments that would define the later medieval period. The westward expansion had been the final expression of the restless energy that had driven Viking civilization from its origins in the tribal societies of early Scandinavia. Now that energy would be channeled in new directions, as the descendants of Viking warriors and explorers learned to become the kings and merchants of medieval Europe. The transformation that swept through Scandinavia in the early 11th century was as profound as any earthquake, yet it happened so gradually that contemporaries barely noticed the ground shifting beneath their feet. The Viking Age wasn't ended by foreign conquest or natural disaster. It was consumed by its own success, transformed by forces that the Vikings themselves had set in motion centuries earlier. By 1000 AD, the restless energy that had once driven young warriors across unknown seas was increasingly being channeled into a different kind of ambition: the consolidation of royal power within Scandinavia itself. The same organizational skills that had created trading empires stretching from Greenland to Constantinople were now being applied to the more mundane, but ultimately more important task of building centralized kingdoms that could compete with the emerging nation-states of medieval Europe. The irony was almost poetic. The Vikings had spent 2 centuries teaching European rulers how to defend themselves against seaborne raids, how to organize professional armies, and how to build fortifications that could withstand siege warfare. Now they found themselves facing enemies who had learned those lessons all too well, while their own traditional advantages, mobility, surprise, technological superiority, were being steadily eroded by opponents who could match their ships, counter their tactics, and most importantly, sustain losses that would have broken earlier generations of defenders. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 would become the symbolic end of the Viking Age, when Harald Hardrada fell attempting to claim the English throne that his ancestors had seized with such apparent ease. But the real transformation had begun decades earlier in the halls of Scandinavian kings, who understood that the old ways of raiding and trading were giving way to new realities that demanded different responses. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark exemplified this transition. His famous conversion to Christianity around 960 wasn't just a personal religious decision. It was a calculated political move designed to integrate Denmark into the broader European community on terms that preserved Danish independence while acknowledging changed circumstances. The runic inscription on the Jelling stone, which Harald commissioned to commemorate his achievements, captures this moment perfectly. Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. The phrase "won for himself" is crucial. Harald wasn't claiming to have conquered these territories through traditional Viking raids, but to have unified them through the more complex process of political consolidation that required diplomatic skill as much as military prowess. The conversion to Christianity wasn't an abandonment of traditional values, but their adaptation to new strategic requirements. This adaptation process was neither smooth nor uniform across Scandinavia. In Norway, the consolidation efforts of Harald Fairhair and his successors created the very population pressures that had driven the initial Viking expansion, as displaced nobles fled overseas rather than accept subordinate positions in the emerging royal hierarchy. In Sweden, the process was complicated by the wealth flowing in from eastern trade routes, which provided alternative sources of power that could challenge royal authority. But perhaps the most significant change was generational. The warriors who had established the great Viking settlements were being replaced by their sons and grandsons, who had grown up not as landless adventurers seeking their fortunes overseas, but as established aristocrats with inherited positions to defend and expand. These second and third generation Viking leaders thought in terms of territorial states rather than mobile warbands, permanent institutions rather than personal relationships. The evolution is most clearly visible in the career of Nut the Great, who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously in the early 11th century. Nut was recognizably a Viking leader. He had seized the English throne through military conquest and maintained his power through a combination of Danish supporters and Anglo-Saxon administrators. But his methods of governance were fundamentally different from those of earlier Viking conquerors. Where previous Viking leaders had ruled through personal charisma and the distribution of plunder, Knut established bureaucratic institutions that could function without his constant presence. Where earlier Vikings had maintained their power through the threat of renewed raiding, Knut derived his authority from legal frameworks that integrated Scandinavian and English traditions. Most importantly, where traditional Viking leadership had been essentially military in character, Knut's authority was fundamentally administrative. This shift from military to administrative leadership reflected broader changes in the nature of political power throughout medieval Europe. The feudal systems that were emerging in France and Germany required rulers who could manage complex networks of personal relationships, legal obligations, and territorial rights. The Byzantine Empire that controlled the eastern trade routes demanded diplomatic partners who understood court protocol and commercial law. Even the Islamic powers that had provided so much of the silver that funded Viking expansion expected to deal with stable governments, rather than opportunistic raiders. The Vikings who succeeded in this new environment were those who could adapt their traditional skills to meet these changed expectations. The same strategic thinking that had made them master raiders now made them effective diplomats. The organizational abilities that had enabled them to coordinate complex expeditions across thousands of miles now served them in managing territorial administrations. The cultural flexibility that had allowed them to integrate into societies from Dublin to Kiev now helped them navigate the increasingly complex world of medieval international relations. But this adaptation came at a cost that many traditional Vikings found unacceptable. The warrior culture that had celebrated individual achievement and personal freedom was giving way to hierarchical systems that emphasized collective responsibility and institutional loyalty. The egalitarian assemblies that had governed early Viking expeditions were being replaced by royal courts where access to power depended on birth and appointment, rather than merit and courage. The resistance to these changes took many forms, from the traditional conservatism of Icelandic society to the violent rebellions that periodically convulsed Norway and Sweden. But perhaps the most significant resistance came from the Viking communities that had established themselves outside Scandinavia, where traditional values could be preserved even as the homeland underwent political transformation. The Varangian Guard that served Byzantine emperors throughout the 11th and 12th centuries represented one form of this resistance. These were Scandinavian warriors who had chosen to maintain their traditional military culture by serving foreign rulers rather than accept subordinate positions in the emerging royal hierarchies of their homelands. Their legendary loyalty to the Byzantine throne wasn't just professional dedication, it was a conscious rejection of the political changes that were transforming Viking society. Similarly, the Scandinavian communities in Russia maintained distinctively Viking characteristics long after their cousins in the West had been absorbed into medieval European civilization. The trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea continued to be dominated by merchants who combined traditional Viking seamanship with sophisticated commercial practices, creating hybrid cultures that preserved essential elements of the old warrior ethos within new economic frameworks. But the most important form of resistance was cultural rather than political. The literary traditions that flourished in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries represented a systematic attempt to preserve the memory of Viking values and achievements, even as the political structures that had created those achievements were disappearing. The sagas that were composed during this period weren't just entertainment. They were historical documents designed to maintain cultural continuity across generations of political change. The anonymous authors of these works understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. The Heimskringla, attributed to Snorri Sturluson but reflecting broader cultural concerns, begins with the explicit recognition that the age of heroes was ending, and that future generations would need written records to understand the achievements of their ancestors. The saga writers weren't just storytellers, they were cultural archivists, working to preserve a way of life that was vanishing before their eyes. This literary preservation project was remarkably successful. The images of Viking culture that dominate modern popular imagination, the emphasis on individual heroism, the celebration of exploration and adventure, the complex honor codes that balanced personal ambition with community loyalty, derive largely from these medieval Icelandic texts, rather than from contemporary sources from the height of the Viking Age itself. But the saga tradition also reveals the profound ambivalence that many Scandinavians felt about the transformation of their society. The heroes of these stories are typically men who lived according to traditional values in a world that was changing around them, often tragic figures whose adherence to ancient codes brought them into conflict with new realities they couldn't fully understand or accept. The saga of the Volsungs, the saga of Njal, the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson. These aren't simple adventure stories, but complex meditations on the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility, between traditional honor and practical necessity, between the heroic ideals of the past and the administrative requirements of the present. The economic foundations of this cultural transformation were as important as the political and military changes. The wealth that had flowed into Scandinavia through 2 centuries of raiding and trading had created new social classes with different interests and priorities than the warrior aristocracies that had dominated earlier Viking society. Merchants who had accumulated fortunes through long-distance trade were more interested in maintaining stable political conditions that protected their investments than in supporting military adventures that might disrupt profitable commercial relationships. Craftsmen, who had developed sophisticated techniques for working imported materials, wanted predictable supplies of raw materials rather than the irregular windfalls that came from successful raids. Farmers who had improved their agricultural techniques using wealth acquired overseas preferred the security that came from strong royal protection to the independence that had characterized traditional Viking communities. These new social groups provided the foundation for the monarchical systems that emerged throughout Scandinavia during the 11th and 12th centuries. They had economic interests that aligned with royal policies designed to promote trade, maintain order, and establish diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. Most importantly, they possessed the administrative skills necessary to implement the bureaucratic systems that effective royal government required. The result was a fundamental shift in the relationship between rulers and subjects throughout Scandinavian society, where traditional Viking leaders had been essentially military commanders who derived their authority from successful warfare. The new royal dynasties were territorial sovereigns whose power rested on their ability to provide administrative services and maintain economic prosperity. This transformation is most clearly visible in the evolution of urban centres throughout Scandinavia. The trading posts that had emerged during the height of Viking expansion, Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, were gradually replaced by new cities that were designed according to medieval European models, rather than traditional Scandinavian patterns. Stockholm, Oslo, Bergen. These weren't just larger versions of earlier Viking settlements, but fundamentally different kinds of communities. They were administrative centres where royal officials collected taxes and enforced royal law, commercial hubs where international merchants conducted business according to standardised procedures, and cultural centres where new forms of art and literature reflected the integration of Scandinavian traditions with broader European developments. The architectural evolution of these cities reveals the broader cultural transformation that was occurring throughout Scandinavian society. The wooden halls that had housed Viking chieftains were being replaced by stone castles built according to continental models. The simple churches that had marked the initial conversion to Christianity were giving way to elaborate cathedrals that demonstrated royal piety and artistic sophistication. Most significantly, the irregular layouts that had characterized earlier settlements were being replaced by planned street systems that reflected new concepts of urban organization and social hierarchy. But perhaps the most important change was linguistic. The Old Norse that had served as the common language of Viking expansion was gradually fragmenting into the distinct national languages that would define medieval Scandinavian identity. Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian were emerging as separate linguistic traditions that reflected the political boundaries that were dividing the former Viking world into distinct kingdoms. This linguistic fragmentation was both cause and consequence of the political consolidation that was transforming Scandinavian society. Royal courts needed standardized languages for administrative purposes, while the development of distinct national identities required linguistic markers that could distinguish between different peoples who had previously shared common cultural traditions. The religious transformation that accompanied these political and cultural changes was equally profound. The conversion to Christianity that had begun as a diplomatic necessity was evolving into genuine cultural synthesis that created distinctively Scandinavian forms of medieval Christianity. The stave churches that were constructed throughout Norway during the 12th and 13th centuries exemplify this synthesis. These remarkable buildings combined traditional Scandinavian woodworking techniques with Christian architectural symbolism, creating structures that were simultaneously ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, distinctively Nordic and broadly European. More importantly, the theological traditions that developed in medieval Scandinavia reflected the integration of Christian doctrine with traditional Scandinavian values in ways that preserved essential elements of the old warrior culture within new religious frameworks. The emphasis on individual salvation that characterized medieval Christianity was interpreted through concepts of personal honor that derived directly from pre-Christian traditions. The Christian ideal of martyrdom was understood in terms of heroic death that had deep roots in pagan mythology. This religious synthesis was crucial to the successful transformation of Viking society because it provided cultural continuity across generations of political change. Young Scandinavians who had never participated in traditional raids or trading expeditions could still identify with their ancestors' achievements through religious narratives that presented those achievements as preparation for Christian civilization rather than alternatives to it. The success of this transformation is evident in the remarkable stability that characterized Scandinavian society during the later medieval period. The kingdoms that emerged from the consolidation of Viking territories proved remarkably durable, surviving political crises and external threats that destroyed many of their European contemporaries. But this stability came at the cost of the dynamic energy that had made Viking expansion possible in the first place. The restless ambition that had driven Scandinavian warriors across unknown seas was channeled into more predictable pursuits: territorial administration, commercial development, and cultural refinement. The same people who had once terrorized half of Europe became model medieval Christians whose greatest achievements were architectural rather than military. The final irony of the Viking transformation was that its very success made it invisible to later generations. The medieval kingdoms that emerged from Viking consolidation were so thoroughly integrated into European civilization that their origins in the warrior culture of early Scandinavia were largely forgotten. The sophisticated administrative systems, the impressive architectural achievements, and the refined cultural traditions of medieval Denmark, Norway, and Sweden seem to have emerged naturally from European development, rather than representing the adaptation of fundamentally different cultural traditions to European norms. This historical amnesia was reinforced by the Christian chronicles that provided most of the written sources for medieval Scandinavian history. These documents naturally emphasized the religious and cultural achievements that aligned with Christian values, while downplaying the military and commercial activities that had created the foundations for those achievements. The result was a distorted historical narrative that presented the Viking Age as a brief period of barbarism that was fortunately ended by Christian conversion and political consolidation. The reality was far more complex. The Viking Age wasn't ended by external forces, but transformed by internal developments that channeled traditional Scandinavian strengths into new directions that proved remarkably successful in the changed circumstances of medieval Europe. Understanding this transformation is crucial to appreciating the true significance of Viking civilization. The raids and battles that dominate popular imagination were just the most visible aspects of a cultural system that was fundamentally adaptive and innovative. The same qualities that made Vikings successful raiders, organizational skill, technological innovation, cultural flexibility, also made them successful administrators, merchants, and political leaders when circumstances required those roles instead. The Viking Age ended not with defeat, but with victory so complete that it transformed the victors themselves. The descendants of the warriors who had terrorized medieval Europe became the architects of some of its most successful and enduring political institutions. The trading networks that had been established through Viking expansion provided the infrastructure for the commercial developments that would define the later medieval economy. The cultural synthesis that emerged from Viking adaptation to European civilization created artistic and literary traditions that would influence Western culture for centuries. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Viking transformation was the demonstration that even the most distinctive and apparently unchangeable cultural traditions could adapt to radically different circumstances without losing their essential character. The Vikings had shown that it was possible to preserve cultural identity while embracing political and social change, to maintain traditional values while adapting to new realities. This lesson would prove invaluable as European civilization faced the challenges and opportunities that would define the later medieval period. The flexibility and adaptability that had characterized Viking culture provided a model for how traditional societies could respond to the rapid changes that were reshaping the medieval world. The Viking Age was ending, but its influence on the course of European development was just beginning. The networks of trade and communication that Viking expansion had created would provide the foundation for the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages. The political institutions that had emerged from Viking consolidation would serve as models for royal government throughout Northern Europe. The cultural synthesis that had resulted from Viking adaptation would contribute to the intellectual and artistic achievements of medieval civilization. Most importantly, the Viking example had demonstrated that the boundaries between civilization and barbarism, between Christian and pagan, between European and foreign, were far more fluid than medieval theorists had imagined. The successful integration of Viking culture into European civilization had shown that cultural difference was not necessarily cultural opposition, that foreign influences could strengthen rather than weaken traditional institutions. As the 12th century dawned and the last Viking kings transformed themselves into medieval monarchs, the age of expansion was truly over. But the age of influence was just beginning, as the achievements and innovations of Viking civilization began their long process of shaping the development of medieval Europe in ways that would extend far beyond the territories that longships had ever reached. The dragon-headed ships that had once carried terror across the North Sea were being transformed into merchant vessels that carried trade goods and cultural innovations. The warriors who had once struck fear into Christian hearts were becoming the guardians of Christian kingdoms. The raiders who had once seemed to threaten the very foundations of European civilization were becoming integral parts of that civilization's continued development. The Viking Age was ending, but the Viking legacy was eternal. The longships lay empty on beaches that had once echoed with war cries. The workshops that had forged axes for conquest now hammered out plowshares for peaceful fields. By the dawn of the 12th century, the transformation was complete, yet few understood what they had witnessed: the metamorphosis of Europe's most feared warriors into its most successful medieval rulers. But this ending was also a beginning. The networks that Viking expansion had created didn't disappear with the last raid. They evolved into something far more sophisticated and enduring. The same routes that had carried raiders to distant shores now supported merchant fleets that connected the Arctic to the Mediterranean in commercial relationships that would define European prosperity for centuries. The Hanseatic League, that great confederation of trading cities that would dominate northern European commerce throughout the later medieval period, was built directly upon foundations that Viking merchants had established. The trading posts at Novgorod, the commercial networks that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium, the urban centres that had emerged from Viking settlements, all of these provided the infrastructure that medieval merchants would use to create the first truly international economy in European history. Hamburg, Lübeck, Bergen, Stockholm. These weren't just cities that happened to emerge after the Viking Age ended. They were the direct descendants of Viking trading centres, evolved and expanded, but retaining the essential characteristics that had made their predecessors successful. The same understanding of maritime commerce, the same flexibility in dealing with diverse populations, the same willingness to adapt local customs to international requirements that had characterized Viking trade continued to define these medieval commercial hubs. The merchant families that dominated these cities often traced their ancestry directly to Viking settlers, but their identity had been completely transformed. Where their ancestors had combined trading with raiding, these medieval merchants pursued purely commercial objectives. Where earlier generations had relied on military intimidation to secure favorable terms, their descendants used diplomatic negotiation and legal frameworks. The tools had changed, but the fundamental skills, cultural adaptation, strategic thinking, organizational capability remained remarkably consistent. This commercial evolution was particularly visible in the transformation of maritime technology. The longships that had made Viking expansion possible were gradually replaced by specialized vessels designed for specific commercial purposes. The sleek warships that could carry 30 warriors became broad-beamed cargo vessels that could transport tons of grain. The shallow draft raiders that could navigate rivers became deep-water merchants that could cross oceans safely in all seasons. Yet the shipbuilding traditions that had created the original longships continued to influence these new designs. The clinker-built construction that had made Viking vessels so flexible and seaworthy became the standard technique for Northern European shipbuilding throughout the medieval period. The understanding of wood, water, and wind that Viking shipwrights had developed through centuries of experimentation provided the foundation for the maritime revolution that would eventually carry European explorers to every corner of the globe. The navigational knowledge that had enabled Vikings to cross the North Atlantic without instruments became the basis for medieval sailing techniques that would revolutionize ocean travel. The ability to read weather patterns, ocean currents, and celestial movements that had allowed Viking navigators to reach Iceland, Greenland, and North America was preserved and refined by medieval sailors who used these skills to establish regular commercial routes throughout the Atlantic and Baltic. More importantly, the cultural attitudes that had made Viking expansion possible, the willingness to venture into unknown territories, the confidence in dealing with foreign peoples, the ability to adapt quickly to new circumstances, became defining characteristics of Northern European civilization throughout the medieval period. The same restless energy that had once driven raiders across hostile seas now motivated merchants to establish trading posts in distant lands, diplomats to negotiate complex international agreements, and explorers to push beyond the boundaries of the known world. This cultural continuity is most clearly visible in the evolution of Scandinavian kingship during the High Middle Ages. The monarchs who ruled Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in the 12th and 13th centuries were recognizably medieval European kings. They built stone castles, patronized cathedral construction, and participated in the complex diplomatic networks that characterized feudal politics. But their approach to royal government retained distinctively Scandinavian characteristics that reflected their Viking heritage. The emphasis on royal mobility that characterized medieval Scandinavian kingship, for example, derived directly from Viking traditions of itinerant leadership. Where other European monarchs were increasingly establishing fixed capitals and governing through bureaucratic institutions, Scandinavian kings continued to travel throughout their territories, holding court in different locations and maintaining personal relationships with the local leaders. This wasn't primitive government. It was sophisticated administration adapted to geographic and cultural conditions that demanded flexible rather than rigid authority structures. Similarly, the continuing importance of assemblies and consultative institutions in medieval Scandinavian politics reflected the preservation of Viking traditions of collective decision-making within monarchical frameworks. The things that had governed early Viking communities evolved into the parliamentary institutions that would make Scandinavian kingdoms pioneers in representative government throughout the later medieval period. But perhaps the most significant continuity was in the realm of international relations. The diplomatic skills that Viking leaders had developed through centuries of dealing with diverse foreign powers became the foundation for the sophisticated international policies that characterized medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. These weren't isolated northern territories struggling to understand European politics. They were integral participants in medieval diplomacy who often possessed advantages that their more established neighbors lacked. The marriage alliances that connected Scandinavian royal families to dynasties throughout Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries reveal the extent to which former Viking territories had become central to medieval political networks. Danish princesses married Holy Roman emperors. Norwegian kings claimed thrones in Scotland and Ireland. Swedish nobles served as military commanders in crusading armies. The descendants of Viking raiders had become key players in the complex web of relationships that held medieval Europe together. This integration was facilitated by the religious transformation that had accompanied political consolidation. But the form that Christianity took in Scandinavia retained distinctive characteristics that reflected the cultural synthesis that had been occurring throughout the transformation period. The austere piety that characterized medieval Scandinavian Christianity, The emphasis on individual conscience and personal responsibility, the continuing importance of heroic ideals within Christian frameworks. All of these reflected the adaptation of traditional Viking values to Christian doctrine, rather than their replacement by foreign religious traditions. The architectural achievements of medieval Scandinavia provide striking visual evidence of this cultural synthesis. The stave churches that dotted the Norwegian landscape combined Christian symbolism with construction techniques and decorative motifs that had deep roots in pre-Christian tradition. These weren't crude attempts to copy foreign models, but sophisticated architectural innovations that created distinctively Scandinavian forms of Christian expression. The carved portals of these churches reveal the complexity of the cultural transformation that had occurred. Biblical scenes were rendered using artistic conventions that derived from Viking metalwork and wood carving. Christian saints were depicted with attributes that recalled pagan heroes. The dragons and serpents that decorated church doorways weren't just ornamental. They were symbolic representations of the conquest of pagan forces by Christian virtue, but rendered in forms that preserved the artistic traditions that had created the original dragon-headed longships. This artistic synthesis extended to manuscript illumination, metalwork, and sculpture throughout medieval Scandinavia. The famous Lewis chessmen, carved in the 12th century, but discovered centuries later on a remote Scottish island, exemplify the cosmopolitan character that Scandinavian art had achieved. These ivory pieces combine Norse carving traditions with European gaming customs and artistic influences that could only have emerged from the international networks that Viking expansion had created. But the most important artistic achievement of medieval Scandinavia was literary. The saga tradition that flourished in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries represented not just the preservation of historical memory, but the creation of entirely new literary forms that would influence European literature for centuries. The narrative techniques developed by saga writers, the use of understated prose to convey powerful emotions, the complex character development that revealed psychological depth, the sophisticated plot structures that balanced multiple storylines, established literary conventions that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in Europe until the Renaissance. These literary innovations weren't accidental. They reflected the cultural needs of societies that were attempting to preserve traditional values within radically changed circumstances. The saga writers understood that they were creating more than entertainment. They were crafting cultural documents that would enable future generations to understand their heritage, even as that heritage was being transformed by historical forces beyond anyone's control. The success of this literary preservation project is evident in the continuing influence of Viking imagery and values in modern culture. The emphasis on individual heroism, the celebration of exploration and adventure, the complex honor codes that balance personal ambition with community loyalty. These characteristics that we associate with Viking culture derive largely from medieval literary sources, rather than from contemporary accounts of the Viking Age itself. But this literary transformation also reveals the profound changes that had occurred in Scandinavian society. The heroes of the sagas are typically men who lived according to traditional values in a world that was changing around them. They are often tragic figures whose adherence to ancient codes brings them into conflict with new realities they cannot fully understand or accept. The saga writers weren't just celebrating the past. They were exploring the tensions between traditional and modern values that continued to define their own contemporary experience. This literary exploration of cultural change was particularly important because it provided a framework for understanding the transformation that had occurred throughout Scandinavian society. The same tensions between individual freedom and social responsibility, between traditional honor and practical necessity, between heroic ideals and administrative requirements that characterize saga narratives were being experienced by real people throughout medieval Scandinavia as they adapted to changed circumstances while attempting to preserve essential aspects of their cultural identity. The economic foundations of this cultural transformation were as important as the political and literary developments. The wealth that had flowed into Scandinavia through 2 centuries of raiding and trading had created new social classes with different interests and priorities than the warrior aristocracies that had dominated earlier Viking society. But these new social groups weren't simply replacing traditional elites. They were evolving from them through processes of adaptation that preserved essential characteristics while changing specific practices. The merchant families that dominated medieval Scandinavian cities, for example, often descended directly from Viking raiders and traders, but their approach to commerce was fundamentally different from their ancestors' methods. Where earlier generations had combined trading with raiding, medieval merchants pursued purely commercial objectives. Where Viking traders had relied on personal relationships and military intimidation, their descendants used legal contracts and institutional frameworks. The tools had changed, but the fundamental skills, cultural flexibility, strategic thinking, organizational capacity, remained remarkably consistent. This commercial evolution was particularly visible in the development of specialized crafts and industries that built upon technologies and techniques that had been developed during the Viking Age. The metalworking traditions that had created the finest Viking weapons evolved into sophisticated armament industries that supplied medieval armies throughout Europe. The shipbuilding knowledge that had produced the longships became the foundation for commercial shipyards that dominated northern European maritime construction. The textile production that had clothed Viking expeditions expanded into international industries that competed successfully in markets from England to Russia. But perhaps the most important economic development was the emergence of financial institutions that could support long-distance commerce without requiring the personal presence and military protection that had characterized Viking trading expeditions. The banking houses that emerged in medieval Scandinavian cities weren't just commercial enterprises. They were institutional innovations that allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances using credit instruments and legal frameworks rather than armed force. This financial revolution was closely connected to the legal developments that characterized the transformation of Scandinavian society. The law codes that emerged during the medieval period weren't simply adaptations of earlier tribal customs. They were sophisticated legal systems that combined traditional Scandinavian concepts of justice with European legal principles and commercial practices that had been developed through centuries of international trade. The success of these legal innovations is evident in their influence on legal development throughout Northern Europe. The commercial law that was codified in medieval Scandinavian cities became the basis for trading regulations throughout the Baltic region. The maritime law that governed Scandinavian shipping provided models for international agreements that regulated ocean commerce throughout the medieval period. The administrative law that enabled Scandinavian kings to govern large territories efficiently was copied and adapted by rulers throughout Northern and Eastern Europe. This legal influence reflected the broader impact that the transformation of Viking society was having on European civilization as a whole. The same organizational skills that had made Viking expansion possible were now being applied to the challenges of medieval governance, with results that often surpassed the achievements of more established European powers. The military contributions that medieval Scandinavian kingdoms made to European conflicts reveal the extent to which former Viking territories had become integral to continental politics. The Scandinavian troops who participated in the Crusades weren't foreign mercenaries fighting for pay. They were Christian warriors, fulfilling religious obligations while advancing their kingdom's diplomatic and commercial interests. The naval forces that Scandinavian rulers provided for various European conflicts weren't auxiliary units. They were often the most effective maritime forces available to medieval commanders. This military integration was particularly important because it demonstrated that the transformation of Viking society hadn't weakened Scandinavian military capabilities. It had redirected them toward objectives that aligned with broader European interests, while preserving the tactical innovations and technological advantages that had made Viking warriors so formidable. The siege techniques that Vikings had developed through centuries of river warfare became valuable assets in medieval conflicts where fortified positions were increasingly important. The amphibious warfare capabilities that had made Viking raids so effective were adapted to support legitimate military operations that required coordinating land and sea forces. The logistical systems that had enabled Viking expeditions to operate thousands of miles from their bases provided models for medieval armies that needed to sustain campaigns in distant territories. But perhaps the most important military contribution was conceptual rather than practical. The Viking understanding of warfare as a combination of military action, political negotiation, and economic calculation provided medieval European commanders with strategic frameworks that were more sophisticated than the purely military approaches that had characterized earlier medieval conflicts. This strategic sophistication was particularly evident in the Northern Crusades, where Scandinavian rulers used religious justifications to pursue territorial expansion and commercial objectives that advanced their kingdom's interests while fulfilling their Christian obligations. These campaigns weren't simple religious wars. They were complex political and economic enterprises that required the same combination of military skill, diplomatic acumen, and cultural adaptability that had characterized Viking expansion centuries earlier. The success of these Northern Crusades demonstrated that the transformation of Viking society had enhanced rather than diminished Scandinavian capabilities. The same peoples who had once terrorized Christian Europe were now serving as champions of Christian expansion, using traditional skills in service of new objectives that aligned with contemporary political and religious priorities. This transformation was complete by the beginning of the 13th century, when the last vestiges of traditional Viking culture had been either eliminated or thoroughly integrated into medieval European civilization. The dragon-headed ships had disappeared from the seas, replaced by merchant vessels and naval squadrons that served legitimate political authorities. The warrior bands that had once roamed the continent seeking plunder and glory had evolved into professional armies that served their kings and defended their territories according to medieval concepts of just warfare. But the Viking legacy wasn't disappearing. It was being transformed into influences that would shape European development for centuries to come. The commercial networks that Viking traders had established provided the infrastructure for the economic growth that would characterize the High Middle Ages. The political institutions that had emerged from Viking consolidation would serve as models for royal government throughout Northern Europe. The cultural synthesis that had resulted from Viking adaptation would contribute to the intellectual and artistic achievements of medieval civilization. Most importantly, the Viking example had demonstrated that profound cultural change was possible without losing essential identity. The successful transformation of Scandinavian society had shown that traditional values could be preserved while adapting to radically different circumstances, that cultural distinctiveness could coexist with political integration, that foreign influences could strengthen rather than weaken indigenous traditions. As the 13th century progressed and medieval European civilization reached its highest achievements, the influence of this Viking transformation became increasingly evident. The commercial prosperity that supported Gothic cathedral building, the political stability that enabled the development of universities, the cultural confidence that produced scholastic philosophy, all of these achievements rested partially on foundations that had been laid during the centuries of Viking expansion and the transformation that followed. The Viking Age had ended, but its influence on the course of human development was just beginning to be fully realized. The networks of communication and exchange that Viking enterprise had created would provide the framework for the global expansion of European civilization that would define the later medieval and early modern periods. The institutional innovations that had emerged from Viking political consolidation would influence the development of nation-states throughout Europe. The cultural synthesis that had characterized the Viking transformation would serve as a model for how traditional societies could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving their essential character. In the end, The greatest Viking conquest wasn't any territory they seized or any treasure they accumulated. It was the transformation of European civilization itself, accomplished not through the destruction of existing institutions, but through their adaptation and enhancement. The descendants of tribal raiders had become the architects of medieval prosperity, the guardians of Christian civilization, and the pioneers of global exploration. Their ships no longer carried terror across the seas. They carried the seeds of the modern world. The dragon ships were gone, but their legacy sailed on in forms no Viking could have imagined. As the 13th century dawned across northern Europe, something extraordinary was happening in the trading halls of Bergen, the royal courts of Copenhagen, and the merchant districts of Stockholm. The descendants of men who had once measured wealth in silver arm rings and counted victories in burned monasteries were now calculating profits in ledger books and negotiating treaties in Latin. Yet beneath these medieval trappings, the essential Viking genius remained unchanged. The ability to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles, to adapt ancient skills to new circumstances, to transform challenges into advantages through sheer audacity and intelligence. The Hanseatic League represented the ultimate expression of this transformed Viking spirit. When German merchants began organizing their great commercial confederation in the 12th century, they weren't creating something entirely new. They were systematizing and expanding networks that Scandinavian traders had been developing for centuries. The League's emphasis on maritime commerce, its flexible political structure, its ability to operate across national boundaries while maintaining distinct local identities, all of these characteristics reflected principles that had been refined through generations of Viking expansion. But the League also revealed how completely the Viking world had evolved. Where earlier Scandinavian traders had relied on personal relationships and military intimidation to secure favorable terms, Hanseatic merchants operated through legal contracts and institutional frameworks. Where Viking expeditions had been essentially family enterprises led by charismatic warriors, the League was a sophisticated commercial organization that could coordinate activities across dozens of cities and multiple kingdoms. The transformation was visible in every aspect of Northern European life. The wooden halls where Viking jarls had distributed treasure to their followers became stone castles where medieval nobles administered vast territories through bureaucratic systems. The Thing assemblies, where free farmers had debated community issues, evolved into parliamentary institutions that would pioneer representative government throughout Europe. The skaldic poetry that had celebrated individual heroism was replaced by chronicles and histories that documented collective achievements. Most remarkably, this transformation occurred without destroying the essential characteristics that had made Viking culture so dynamic and successful. The same qualities that had enabled a few thousand Scandinavian farmers to reshape medieval Europe: organizational brilliance, technological innovation, cultural adaptability, now served their descendants as they helped build the foundations of modern European civilization. The evidence was everywhere for those who knew how to read it. The Gothic cathedrals that began rising across northern Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries weren't just architectural achievements. They were monuments to the commercial prosperity that Viking-established trade networks had made possible. The stone for these magnificent buildings came from quarries that Scandinavian merchants had been exploiting for generations. The craftsmen who carved their elaborate decorations had learned their skills in workshops that traced their traditions back to Viking artisans. The wealth that funded their construction flowed through commercial networks that still followed routes first mapped by Viking explorers. The universities that emerged during this same period represented another form of Viking legacy. The intellectual curiosity that had driven Scandinavian explorers to the edges of the known world now motivated scholars to push the boundaries of human knowledge. The same willingness to venture into unknown territories that had carried Vikings to North America now drove medieval thinkers to explore uncharted realms of philosophy, theology, and natural science. The organizational skills that had enabled Viking leaders to coordinate complex expeditions across vast distances proved equally valuable in academic contexts. The administrative systems that governed medieval universities, the networks of communication that connected scholars across different kingdoms, the institutional structures that preserved and transmitted knowledge. All of these reflected organizational principles that had been developed through centuries of Viking expansion. But perhaps the most important legacy was conceptual rather than institutional. The Viking understanding of the world as a place of unlimited possibilities, where traditional boundaries could be crossed and conventional limitations could be overcome through courage and intelligence, became a defining characteristic of medieval European culture. This wasn't just optimism. It was a sophisticated understanding of how human societies could be transformed through strategic action and creative adaptation. This conceptual legacy is most clearly visible in the great exploration projects that characterized the later medieval period. When Portuguese navigators began pushing down the African coast in the 14th and 15th centuries, they were following principles that Viking explorers had established centuries earlier. Systematic reconnaissance, careful documentation of discoveries, establishment of supply bases to support extended voyages, and most importantly, the understanding that geographic knowledge was the foundation of commercial and political advantage. The same principles guided the Italian merchants who established trading posts throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, the German explorers who pushed into Eastern Europe, and eventually the Spanish and Portuguese adventurers who would carry European influence to the Americas and Asia. All of these enterprises reflected the Viking insight that mobility and adaptability were more valuable than static defensive strength, that cultural flexibility was more important than rigid adherence to traditional practices. The technological foundations for these later achievements had also been established during the Viking Age. The shipbuilding techniques that had created the longships evolved into the maritime technologies that would enable global exploration. The navigational knowledge that had carried Vikings across the North Atlantic became the basis for the oceanic sailing methods that would revolutionize world commerce. The metallurgical skills that had produced Viking weapons contributed to the armament industries that would give European powers their decisive military advantages in global conflicts. But technology alone couldn't explain the extraordinary success of European expansion during the later medieval and early modern periods. The crucial factor was cultural. The Viking inherited understanding that the world was a place to be explored and mastered rather than simply endured. This worldview had been refined through centuries of expansion and adaptation, creating mental frameworks that enabled European societies to respond creatively to challenges that might have paralyzed more traditional civilizations. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century provides a perfect example of how this Viking inherited adaptability functioned in practice. While the plague caused enormous suffering and social disruption throughout the continent, the regions with the strongest Scandinavian cultural influences often recovered more quickly and completely than areas dominated by more rigid social structures. The reasons weren't mysterious. Societies that had been shaped by Viking traditions of mobility and flexibility found it easier to adapt to the demographic and economic changes that the plague created. Commercial networks that had been established according to Viking principles of cultural adaptability proved more resilient than those based on fixed hierarchical relationships. Political institutions that reflected Scandinavian traditions of collective decision-making could respond more effectively to crisis than systems that depended entirely on royal authority. Most importantly, the populations that had inherited Viking cultural traditions possessed psychological resources that enabled them to view catastrophic change as opportunity rather than simply disaster. The same mental frameworks that had enabled their ancestors to see unknown oceans as highways to wealth rather than barriers to expansion now helped medieval Europeans recognize that plague-induced social disruption created possibilities for advancement that wouldn't have existed under normal circumstances. The result was a period of remarkable innovation and creativity that laid the foundations for the Renaissance and the early modern period. The social mobility that plague mortality created was exploited most effectively by populations that had inherited Viking traditions of individual initiative and cultural adaptability. The economic opportunities that demographic change opened up were seized most successfully by commercial networks that operated according to principles that Scandinavian merchants had been developing for centuries. The artistic and intellectual achievements that characterized the late medieval period similarly reflected the continuing influence of Viking cultural legacy. The realistic portraiture that began appearing in 14th century art, the empirical approaches to natural science that would eventually produce the scientific revolution, the literary innovations that would culminate in Renaissance humanism. All of these developments occurred first and most dramatically in regions where Viking cultural influence had been strongest. This wasn't coincidental. The Viking tradition of careful observation and practical experimentation, originally developed for navigation and exploration, provided crucial methodological foundations for the empirical approaches that would transform European intellectual life. The Viking emphasis on individual achievement and personal responsibility created cultural contexts that encouraged the kind of creative innovation that traditional hierarchical societies often suppressed. The Viking understanding of cultural synthesis and adaptation provided conceptual frameworks that enabled European thinkers to integrate diverse intellectual traditions into new and more sophisticated systems of knowledge. By the beginning of the 15th century, the transformation was complete. The tribal societies that had emerged from the fjords and forests of early medieval Scandinavia had evolved into the most dynamic and innovative civilization in human history. Their descendants ruled from London to Moscow, traded from Greenland to the Indian Ocean, and were preparing to carry European influence to every continent on Earth. Yet this extraordinary success contained within it the seeds of its own transformation. The same restless energy that had driven Viking expansion was now pushing European civilization toward global dominance. The organizational skills that had enabled Scandinavian raiders to coordinate complex expeditions were being applied to exploration and colonization projects that would dwarf anything the Vikings had attempted. The cultural adaptability that had allowed Viking settlers to integrate into societies from Dublin to Kiev was being used to establish European communities in environments that made even Greenland seem hospitable. The age of Vikings was over, but the age of European expansion was just beginning. The longships had evolved into caravels and galleons. The warrior bands had become professional armies and colonial administrations. The trading posts had grown into global commercial empires. But the essential spirit remained unchanged. The conviction that human intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that cultural boundaries could be crossed and traditional limitations transcended, that the world was a place of unlimited opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The final irony of the Viking story was that its greatest success was also its disappearance. The culture that had begun with a few thousand farmers in the remote corners of northern Europe had been so successful at adapting and expanding that it had transformed into something much larger and more influential than its creators could ever have imagined. The Viking Age had ended not with defeat, but with victory so complete that it had consumed and transformed the victors themselves. Standing on the docks of any major European port in the early 15th century, London, Hamburg, Venice, Seville, an observer would have witnessed the culmination of a process that had begun 7 centuries earlier when the first dragon-headed ships had appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne. The merchant vessels that crowded these harbours carried goods from around the world through commercial networks that still followed routes first mapped by Viking explorers. The crews that sailed these ships used navigational techniques that had been developed by Scandinavian seafarers. The political and economic systems that made this global commerce possible reflected organizational principles that had been refined through centuries of Viking expansion and adaptation. But perhaps most importantly, the men who commanded these expeditions possessed cultural attitudes and mental frameworks that were the direct descendants of Viking worldviews. They saw the ocean as a highway rather than a barrier. They viewed foreign cultures as opportunities for profitable interaction rather than threats to be avoided. They understood that traditional limitations could be overcome through intelligence, determination, and creative adaptation to new circumstances. The Viking Age was history, but the Viking legacy was eternal. In every ship that sailed beyond the horizon, in every explorer who ventured into unknown territories, in every merchant who established trading relationships with foreign peoples, in every society that successfully adapted to changing circumstances while preserving its essential character, the spirit of the Vikings lived on. The dragon ships had vanished from the seas, but their influence would be felt as long as human beings possessed the courage to explore the unknown and the wisdom to learn from what they discovered there. The greatest Viking voyage was not to Iceland or Greenland or even North America. It was the journey from tribal obscurity to global influence, from local significance to universal legacy, from the margins of history to the center of human development. That voyage would never end because it lived on in every person who looked beyond familiar horizons and dared to imagine that the world could be different than it was, better than it had been, greater than anyone had previously thought possible. The Vikings had not just conquered territories or accumulated wealth. They had expanded the boundaries of human possibility itself. That expansion would continue as long as the human spirit retained the capacity for wonder, adventure, and the relentless pursuit of something more than mere survival. The story that had begun with mysterious strangers appearing from the northern mists had become the story of civilization itself, forever changed by contact with people who refused to accept that the world had limits that could not be crossed, challenges that could not be overcome, or dreams that were too ambitious to pursue. The Viking Age was over, but the age of endless possibility that it had created would endure forever. The echoes of their achievement ripple through time like stones cast into still water, each circle expanding wider than the last. In the merchant districts of medieval London, where traders from across the known world haggled over prices in a dozen languages, the organizational principles that governed their commerce traced directly back to the trading protocols that Viking merchants had established centuries earlier. The letters of credit that enabled a Flemish wool merchant to conduct business with a Novgorod fur trader without ever meeting face to face. These were refinements of trust networks that Scandinavian adventurers had pioneered when they first realized that reputation could be more valuable than sword strength. But perhaps the most profound transformation was invisible, woven so deeply into the fabric of European consciousness that contemporaries barely noticed its presence. The medieval mind that could conceive of sending ships beyond the edge of the known world, that could imagine profits from ventures that might not return for years, that could envision political alliances spanning continents. This was a mental landscape that the Vikings had created through their relentless expansion of what seemed possible for human beings to achieve. When Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria in 1492, staring into the Atlantic vastness that stretched toward an uncertain horizon, he carried with him more than Spanish royal commissions and Italian ambitions. He carried the accumulated wisdom of generations of northern seafarers who had learned to read the ocean's moods, to trust their vessels to waters that had never known human presence, to believe that courage and skill could bridge any gap between the known and the unknown. The navigational techniques that guided his ships westward had been refined in the cold waters off Iceland and Greenland. The mental frameworks that allowed him to imagine reaching Asia by sailing west reflected a geographic understanding that Viking explorers had been developing for 5 centuries. Most crucially, the simple conviction that the ocean was a pathway rather than a barrier embodied a worldview that had been forged in the fjords of Norway and tested in the storms of the North Atlantic. Yet Columbus himself probably never consciously connected his enterprise to Viking precedents. The The transformation had been so complete, so thoroughly integrated into European culture, that its origins had become invisible. The same process that had converted Danish raiders into English kings, Swedish adventurers into Russian princes, and Norwegian farmers into Icelandic republicans, had now elevated their collective achievements into universal human capabilities. This invisibility was perhaps the ultimate measure of Viking success. They had not simply conquered territories or accumulated wealth, they had expanded the boundaries of human imagination itself. The idea that ordinary people could cross vast distances, adapt to alien environments, and create new forms of civilization in previously empty lands had evolved from a distinctly Scandinavian innovation into a fundamental assumption of European culture. The implications extended far beyond exploration and commerce. The same mental flexibility that had enabled Vikings to thrive in environments ranging from the Russian steppes to the Greenlandic ice fields now allowed European societies to adapt to challenges that would have paralyzed more rigid civilizations. When the Ottoman Empire closed traditional trade routes to Asia, European merchants didn't simply accept the loss. They innovated alternative pathways that would ultimately prove more profitable than the original connections. When the printing press began revolutionizing the spread of information in the 15th century, the societies that adapted most quickly and effectively were those that had inherited Viking traditions of cultural synthesis and technological innovation. The same openness to foreign ideas that had allowed Scandinavian traders to learn Arabic numerals, Byzantine commercial law, and Islamic navigation techniques now enabled European scholars to integrate classical knowledge, Arabic science, and empirical observation into new intellectual frameworks that would transform human understanding of the natural world. The university systems that spread throughout Europe during the High Middle Ages reflected organizational principles that had been developing since the first Viking expeditions learned to coordinate complex activities across vast distances. The academic networks that connected scholars from Oxford to Prague, from Paris to Krakow, operated according to communication protocols that echoed the information systems that had enabled Viking traders to maintain commercial relationships from Dublin to Constantinople. But the most remarkable continuity was psychological, rather than institutional. The intellectual courage that drove medieval scholars to question established authorities, to propose new explanations for natural phenomena, to imagine alternative ways of organizing human society. This reflected the same willingness to challenge conventional limitations that had originally motivated Scandinavian farmers to sail beyond familiar horizons in search of opportunities that might or might not exist. The scientific revolution that would transform European understanding of the physical universe during the 16th and 17th centuries had its conceptual roots in this Viking-inherited tradition of empirical investigation and practical experimentation. The same methodological approaches that had enabled Scandinavian navigators to develop sophisticated understanding of ocean currents, wind patterns, and celestial movements now guided European natural philosophers as they attempted to decode the mathematical principles that governed planetary motion, chemical reactions, and biological processes. When Galileo pointed his telescope toward the heavens and discovered that the moon had mountains, that Jupiter had satellites, that the Milky Way consisted of countless individual stars, he was employing observational techniques that had been refined through centuries of Scandinavian maritime exploration. The careful documentation of phenomena, the systematic comparison of observations, the willingness to accept evidence that contradicted established beliefs. All of these methodological principles had been developing since Viking explorers first began mapping unknown coastlines and recording the characteristics of unfamiliar territories. The political innovations that would reshape European governance during the early modern period similarly reflected the continuing influence of Scandinavian institutional traditions. The parliamentary systems that began emerging throughout Northern Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries weren't simply responses to immediate political pressures. They were institutional expressions of participatory decision-making traditions that traced back to the Thing assemblies, where Viking communities had debated collective policies. The concept of representative government that would eventually transform political organization throughout the Western world had its practical origins in the governance systems that Viking settlers had developed to manage their overseas colonies. The same principles that had enabled Icelandic farmers to create the Althing, Greenlandic colonists to coordinate their activities without royal supervision, and Russ traders to establish effective administration across the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, now provided conceptual foundations for the political experiments that would define modern democratic institutions. The economic theories that began emerging during the late medieval period reflected an equally profound debt to Viking commercial innovations. The understanding of markets as self-regulating systems, the recognition that competition could produce benefits for entire societies rather than just individual participants, the sophisticated analysis of supply and demand relationships, all of these insights had been developing since Scandinavian merchants first began operating in the complex international networks that connected Northern Europe to Byzantium and the Islamic world. The banking systems that enabled the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages were direct descendants of the credit networks that Viking traders had established to manage long-distance transactions. The insurance mechanisms that made oceanic commerce economically viable reflected risk assessment techniques that had been refined through centuries of Scandinavian maritime enterprise. The accounting methods that allowed medieval businesses to track complex international operations evolved from the record-keeping systems that Viking expeditions had developed to manage multi-year trading voyages. But perhaps the most significant legacy was cultural rather than institutional or technological. The Viking transformation had demonstrated that human societies possessed an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation and innovation when circumstances demanded creative responses to new challenges. This insight had become so thoroughly integrated into European consciousness that it shaped responses to every subsequent crisis or opportunity. When the Black Death devastated European populations during the 14th century, the regions that recovered most successfully were those that had inherited Viking traditions of social mobility and economic flexibility. When the Ottoman expansion threatened traditional trade routes during the 15th century, the societies that developed the most effective alternatives were those that possessed Viking-derived experience in long-distance commerce and cultural adaptation. When the discovery of the Americas created unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion during the 16th century, the European powers that proved most successful at colonial enterprise were those that had learned the lessons that Viking settlers had been teaching for 7 centuries. The patterns were consistent across different periods and contexts because they reflected deep cultural assumptions about the nature of human capability and the possibilities for social transformation. The same worldview that had enabled a few thousand Scandinavian farmers to reshape medieval Europe now allowed European civilization as a whole to extend its influence throughout the globe. As the 16th century dawned and European explorers began establishing permanent settlements in the Americas, they carried with them not just superior military technology and epidemic diseases, but also intellectual frameworks and institutional models that had been developing since the first Viking expeditions had demonstrated that small groups of determined individuals could establish successful communities in previously unknown territories. The Spanish conquistadors who toppled the Aztec and Inca empires weren't just employing military tactics. They were implementing strategies of cultural adaptation and alliance building that echoed techniques that Viking leaders had used to establish their authority over much larger indigenous populations in Ireland, England, and Russia. The Portuguese traders who established commercial networks throughout the Indian Ocean weren't simply following established routes. They were creating new forms of international commerce that reflected organizational principles that Scandinavian merchants had been developing for centuries. The English colonists who established permanent settlements along the North American coast weren't just seeking religious freedom or economic opportunity. They were participating in a tradition of overseas expansion that had been continuous since the first Viking families had sailed west from Norway to establish new communities in Iceland and Greenland. The transformation was complete yet it continued. The Viking Age had ended, but the age of global European expansion that it had made possible was just beginning. The longships had evolved into galleons and frigates. The warrior bands had become professional armies and colonial administrations. The trading posts had grown into global commercial empires. But the essential spirit remained unchanged. The conviction that human intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that cultural boundaries could be crossed and traditional limitations transcended, that the world was a place of unlimited opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The greatest Viking voyage was not to Iceland or Greenland or even North America. It was the journey from tribal obscurity to global influence, from local significance to universal legacy, from the margins of history to the very center of human development. That journey had transformed not just the Vikings themselves, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. As we stand at our own historical moment, surrounded by technologies and possibilities that medieval minds could never have imagined, we remain the inheritors of that original Viking insight, that the world has no fixed boundaries, that human societies can adapt to any challenge, that the horizon is not a limit, but an invitation. The dragon ships have long since rotted away, but their legacy sails on in every human enterprise that dares to venture beyond the familiar, to explore the unknown, to believe that tomorrow can be fundamentally different from today. The Viking Age was a chapter in human history, but the story it began will continue as long as human beings possess the courage to explore, the wisdom to adapt, and the vision to imagine possibilities beyond the limits of their current circumstances. The greatest conquest of the Vikings was not any territory they seized, but the expansion of human imagination itself, and that conquest, unlike all the others, truly was eternal.